Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express-News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by...
Josh Brodesky, editorial page editor.
Business editor Greg Jefferson.
Reporter, I guess, Brian Chasnoff.
Yeah. That's for this week.
It changes every time.
Yeah, I know. I'm really jealous of that.
Thanks for having me on.
No, glad to do it. And this week is the beginning of early voting. We have a November 5th election, and we've got 10 statewide propositions on the ballot. And we're really lucky to have both Josh and Brian. Brian, you've been working on the editorial board the last few weeks.
That's right. About 6 weeks now.
Yeah. So the editorial board, a lot of these propositions, these are things that I think it's a challenge to get people to come out to vote whenever you're not voting on candidates, but you're voting on these kinds of ballot items. And the editorial board, I think, did a really good job of sort of breaking down what all these propositions mean and giving some guidance to voters. Josh, if you could just talk a little bit, because I think I get a lot of questions. I think in the years that I've worked here, people sometimes I think are confused about the editorial board and how its role in the paper and how you all go about making the endorsements you do. What was the process like for this?
Yeah, well, let's start with the confusion about the editorial board because, that comes up quite a bit. And it's something that I'm very new to being editorial page editor. It's something that I've become acutely aware of as readers contact me. So the editorial board is the opinion section of the newspaper, and we are completely separate from the news side. So we're not involved with daily reporting. We're not involved with those front page stories. We're not involved with Gilbert's column or Greg's column or Greg's business coverage. We're totally separate. And so what we do is we manage the opinion of our section, and part of that process is traditionally editorial boards. They make recommendations in elections, and those are nonpartisan recommendations. We're not affiliated with a party. We look at policies and issues and sort of come to conclusions about candidates. In this case, we have this election we're strictly looking at the constitutional amendments. So the process that we went through is we divided these up among the various members of the editorial board. We researched them. We looked at the pro and con arguments. In some instances, we spoke with sources to kind of get a better understanding of what the impacts were. And then we're offering our recommendations to sort of demystify the ballot to voters. But whether or not people agree with our recommendations, that's really sort of the agreement or disagreement is really secondary. What we really want are people to get out there and vote. And obviously people who read editorials and newspapers, those are potentially likely voters. So I think 2 years ago, turnout for constitutional amendments was 3%, something like that, or maybe, I think it was 3% in 2017, and we could just do so much better.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so for those of you who are listening and want a little bit of help in trying to make sense of these propositions, these are propositions that were put on the ballot by the state legislature. Of the 10, there were 2 that you all recommended that people vote against. And I'd like to talk a little bit about those 2 first, and then we can get to the ones that you all are in favor of. You got Proposition 1, and the wording of this is it's the constitutional amendment permitting a person to hold more than one office as a municipal judge at the same time. Now, my understanding on this is that in the state, people you can be a municipal judge in multiple jurisdictions if you're appointed. But if you're in a jurisdiction where municipal judges are elected, you currently wouldn't be able to do this. And this constitutional amendment would allow people to do that. And you all are against that. What is your thinking on this?
Well, the argument for this was the argument for allowing elected municipal judges to serve in multiple jurisdictions was to help rural communities that have a hard time filling these positions, right? Our concern was that, when you're elected to a position, that should be your focus. We don't. It's not like you don't serve as a county commissioner in one place and then serve on a water board somewhere else. That it sets a very bad precedent. And that when we looked at this, so what these communities really could do is they could just change their charters, and they could say, instead of electing municipal judges, we will appoint them, and then appointed judges can, they can serve in multiple jurisdictions. And so to us, that makes much more sense in doing a statewide constitutional amendment. So in San Antonio, municipal judges are appointed. So to us, that was just a no-brainer.
Yeah, so that's Proposition 1, and that's that the recommendation was against. You also recommended voting against Proposition 4, and this would prohibit the imposition of an individual income tax, including a tax on an individual's share of partnership, unincorporated association income. Now, we don't have an income tax in the state of Texas, and I think the way things stand now, for us to have an income tax, it would have to be approved by the voters. And this would actually, I think, how would this change or make it more difficult? I guess it would require a constitutional amendment to have an income tax.
It would make it harder to bring it to a referendum. It would require more votes in each chamber.
It would require the 2/3 vote rather than a majority of votes.
Supermajority.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it just kind of raises the bar, makes it a little bit. I mean, I don't think that this state is anywhere close to approving an income tax, and I think it's kind of the third rail of Texas, when it comes to Texas politics. But this would just make it a little bit harder. Why did you all believe that this was a bad idea?
I'm going to kick this one over to Brian since he vetted this one.
Right. I mean, Texas already enjoys a strong reputation as being business friendly, and I think the proponents of this just want to ensure that will never ever change.
Yeah.
But we took the position that this is not only is it redundant, but it also ties the hands of future Texans who, for whatever reason, might want to decide this for themselves.
Yeah.
Do you have any? What's the political context for this? Like, why did it come up now? I mean, like you said, I mean, there's no there is, as far as I can tell, there's zero pressure to introduce an income tax in Texas. So what brought this about?
That's a good question. I mean, I do know that there's widespread support for it. That actually our position is an outlier position on it, and it might be because there's a conservative majority in the legislature who just feels like this is a good idea. But,
I didn't follow the process closely, but I mean, it just seems to me that it has the kind of the little bit of a smell of grandstanding about it to me. That the idea that you're going to get to come out in favor of making it harder to have an income tax in the state, and you get political credit for it, and really we're already in a position where the voters are going to have the power. We're not going to have the state legislature imposing an income tax in the state. The voters are going to have to approve it as things stand now.
Is that the editorial board's position, or was it just wanting to, have some fiscal flexibility, to not entirely take income tax off?
I mean,
the table?
I think our position is just that it's unnecessary to pass this, and why do something that's unnecessary when it would tie the hands of Texans in the future who might have a reason that we don't have at the moment to do this.
Yeah, I had some emails from readers, and so just to be clear, just because we're by being against Proposition 4, that doesn't mean we're saying we are for an income tax.
Right.
It was just the redundancy of it. But also, when we think of Texas as a low tax state, but anyone who owns a home knows that's not, or when you go out to Best Buy or something, that sales taxes are really high and property taxes are really high. So why would you eliminate a discussion about, a future discussion, when people want to look at revenue streams or how they want to address their taxation?
Economic conditions
But
change.
just to be clear, that doesn't mean we're for an income tax.
Right.
Texas.
And I guess,
nuance.
I guess if you're getting into, hypotheticals, maybe there might be Republicans who maybe they genuinely are concerned about this, or maybe it was just kind of a political statement. But if the legislature flips to the Democratic side by a narrow margin in the near future, this might be a way just to make it more difficult. I personally don't think that if we had a slim Democratic majority in the legislature, that there would be a rush to approve an income tax or get it on the ballot. But
unless Democrats wanted to say, what would it be like to be a one
Right.
majority?
It's like about shooting yourself in the foot.
we could, if we have maybe several masochistic Democrats who get elected in 2020. Okay, so let's now go to the 8 propositions that you all recommended the voters vote for. Proposition 2, this would provide for the issuance of additional general obligation bonds by the Texas Water Development Board in an amount not to exceed $200 million to provide financial assistance for certain projects in economically distressed areas.
Earlier on the podcast, I talked about voter apathy, the idea that 3% turned out last election. Proposition 2 is one of the main reasons why voters should turn out, that they shouldn't be apathetic. It's so important. Proposition 2 is really about funding clean water projects in underserved areas of the state. There are still communities, particularly in the Valley, but all across Texas that don't have access to appropriate clean water infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure, and this program has been really successful. So this would continue that program. So if you're for Texans having clean water, then you should be for Proposition 2. And again, this is not something to be apathetic about.
Right. That's a very good point. Proposition 3. Now, this would authorize the legislature to provide for a temporary exemption from property taxes for people who've I guess their property has been affected by a disaster. We've certainly had disasters that have affected a lot of people in the state in recent years. So you all recommended that people vote for that.
Yeah, it would just provide a higher likelihood of relief for folks who are experiencing these situations.
So they wouldn't have to go and get their property reappraised.
Right.
It would just be, would it be like a 1-year exemption?
It would definitely be temporary.
Yeah.
I mean, right now, it's the taxing unit that decides. This would put the power in the hands of lawmakers who are more accountable to their constituents.
Does it take into account loss of revenue to school districts, to water or river authorities, hospital districts?
Josh?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah. But it basically just taking into account that people who are,
they're in distress.
Suffered, in distress, just to give them some temporary relief on that. So the recommendation is to vote for that. Proposition 5. This would dedicate revenue from the existing sales and use tax that are imposed on sporting goods to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and the Texas Historical Commission to protect Texas natural areas, water quality, and so on. What was your thinking on this one?
Yeah, we're for this one. This is not a new tax. These sales tax dollars are already supposed to be dedicated to these sources. But what happens is the legislature redirects a portion of these tax dollars. So this would simply send the money to where it's intended to go, and the infrastructure needs at state parks in particular, the need is immense. So this is a really easy one to be for.
Yeah, another one that's probably in that same category is Proposition 6. Now, this would enable bonds that are authorized for Cancer Prevention and Research Institute of Texas. It would allow for $3 billion in additional bond money.
Yeah, this is probably the other big one in terms of why people should get out there and vote, is that this is for cancer research funding. I was surprised to learn this, but Texas is the second biggest supporter of cancer research after the federal government. And so, when you look at the impacts for people's lives, actually beyond that, just beyond the health and wellness, just the impact in terms of science, jobs, it's so important to continue this. So.
You got Proposition 7, constitutional amendment allowing increased distribution to the available school fund.
Yeah, so this is tapping the rainy day fund for to provide. Wait, is this tapping the rainy day fund? Can you reread it to me?
I think Proposition 8 actually is
Proposition
the one
8 is the rainy day fund.
Right. And so in case of Constitutional 8, it's providing for the creation of the flood infrastructure fund. So this would come from rainy day funds.
Right.
Okay. To finance drainage, flood mitigation, flood control.
Right.
Obviously, we had a lot of problems.
That's Prop 8.
Yeah. And we had a lot of problems in the state dealing with this. So you're just wanting these funds, which are the state tends to hang on to them and not use them.
It would just be a one-time infusion.
Right.
And something that's important to point out, a lot of times for federal funds, for communities that are suffering from this, they have to match those funds to get them. This would provide a dedicated stream to communities that might have a hard time raising that kind of money.
And let's hop back to Prop 7 real
Sure.
quick. So that was for the education funding, right? So that is money from the GLO in terms of land that they manage and royalties and things like that. And so that's dedicated revenue for public schools.
We're going to get now to the one that that is the not I wouldn't say confusing, but one that's most mystifying to me because I don't know exactly where it's coming from. I'm sure there's more to this. This would authorize the legislature to exempt from ad valorem taxation precious metal held in a precious metal depository located in the state. What's that all about?
So a few years back, the state lawmakers created a depository for metals, so gold or silver or whatnot, and so that I believe is under construction at the moment, but there's still places where it can be deposited. Other depositories don't tax these precious metals, so they're treated like cash, in terms of when you deposit cash in the bank, it's not taxed or things like that. This would just create a level playing field so that Texans would put their precious metals into a Texas depository as opposed to something in Tennessee.
Yeah, so I'm guessing that this was created under President Obama. There's probably a precious metals depository. There's probably a bottled water depository. There's probably like an MRE, meals ready to eat.
Predicting the apocalypse.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's some hope, I think, that the depository will actually generate revenue at some point. But yeah, this happened. This was created by the state lawmakers during the Obama administration, if I remember correctly. But in our view,
there you go.
In our view, the bottom line is that other depositories don't tax these metals, so it would make sense for these metals not to be taxed here.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a big problem with that. I mean, it's not. I don't think it's an issue that any of us were like, been like, out in the streets picketing about. But it's
all kind of silly.
Yeah. Well, you got if you have 10 propositions about it, you're going to have at least one that's going to kind of.
You just summed up the legislature.
Right. Our final one, Proposition 10, this would allow the transfer of law enforcement animals to qualified caretakers. And so this is, I guess, people. You have dogs maybe that are cared for by someone in law enforcement, and then at a certain point, it's like, what do we do with that animal?
So I guess the two obvious examples would be canine dogs for police agencies, and then horses, right? That they're law enforcement agencies that have horses. So they have dedicated handlers in these agencies while these animals are employed. I'm using employed in quotes. While they work for law enforcement during their lifetimes, they go, they're cared for by these people. And then what happens is when those animals retire, then it's actually property, right? It's state public property, and so transferring those animals you can't just give it away. Right. So there's some kind of fee or something like that. This just would pave the way for you, Gilbert. You've been working with this canine for 10 years, and guess what? The canine's retiring, and the canine's going to live with you. Yeah. So anyone who has a heart should vote for this.
Yeah, and it's common sense, and yeah, absolutely. So that. I don't think it's hard to imagine anybody having a real strong opposition to that one.
There's no opposition.
There's no lobby. I think that's fighting against this one, unless I'm wrong about it. Well, now that we've gone through the 10 propositions, and like I said, you've got early voting starting this week and Election Day, November 5th. We've got new voting machines that I have not yet used, but I'm very curious about, which I think, as I understand, this is going to allow on Election Day for people, they're going to have voting centers, and you can now vote in different locations. You don't have to go to one that's in your precinct. That's
a big change, and it'll be just like early voting. You can go wherever is most convenient for you on Election Day.
And I've had several situations where I've been at polling sites or talking to candidates there, and their voters will come up to the candidate and say, "Oh, I went to the wrong place," and people get confused, and it just seems like there's really no reason in 2019 that we can't make it as easy as possible for people. So I'm glad about that. Before we wrap things up, I wanted to get a chance to talk a little bit about what the City Council did last week. They passed the much discussed, much debated Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. And Brian, I know that's something that you've written about. I think it passed with only one dissenting vote, which was Clayton Perry from the North Side. And he's saying, we're not getting any information about how much this is going to cost, and so he was opposed to it for that reason, among others.
Although I believe didn't an initial draft have cost estimates on there, and they took them out to appease folks like Perry? which is kind of ironic, right?
I think the initial
And he
draft.
wants it back.
I don't think the initial draft was specific on cost. I mean,
Okay.
it had these dollar
Those dollar
signs.
amounts, yeah.
So
Yeah,
like
yeah.
it was very kind of like almost like a Yelp review. Like
those-
Yeah,
$5
that's right. That's
signs.
like
It was-
the
it was very
expensive
va-
hotel versus a affordable
In
hotel.
my view, it was very vague.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was very much like that. But
So
I mean,
it's always been vague, I guess.
yeah. So what are your thoughts about this?
Well, what we focused on was the lack of any mention of CPS Energy's coal plants. There are
Right.
2 coal plants, Spruce 1 and Spruce 2. Spruce 1 is an older plant that's scheduled to be shut down, I think, in the next decade. But Spruce 2 was just built in 2010, and it's got a lifespan of 40 to 60 years, and CPS Energy is not interested in committing to shutting that down anytime soon or even putting a date on it.
Right.
And of course, obviously, coal is a huge contributor to climate change.
So I mean, that was a big point of contention. I mean, a lot of
Yeah.
local environmentalists were really unhappy about that.
Right. Go ahead.
I was curious. I don't really remember the circumstances around this as well as I should. But 2010. By this point, you had Julian Castro as mayor. He was very environmentally conscious, and I think he focused a lot on trying to make San Antonio kind of a leader when it came to green energy. Do you all remember what was the
Well, you
process
had-
like in 2010 that allowed for this second one?
2010
to get
is
built?
when it opened. So
This was already.
But you did have. I mean, you had Doyle Beneby, who was chief executive of CPS at the time. I mean, he closed the JT Dealey plant, which was the dirtiest plant in the fleet. He did close it early. I mean, he set that in motion, and that was largely economic. I mean, and just the fact that natural gas, which is a cleaner burning fuel, obviously, than coal, was cheap. Just dirt cheap at the time, and remains cheap. It was not long after he announced the early closing of Dealey that they acquired the gas-fired plant Rio Nogales in I think outside of Seguin, and that actually it didn't completely fill the gap that Dealey would leave, but it came pretty close. And you could close the gap with air with wind and solar, which, by the way, is becoming cheaper as we go along. So.
Yeah. I think though when when Spruce was being planned, it probably goes back to 2002 or something like that.
Right.
I mean, I'm speaking off the top of my head for all the CPS Energy folks out there rolling their eyes, but it goes back. It's like my point is, it goes
These
back
guys.
some number of
They were
years
way
before 2010.
deep into the process by
Right.
that point.
You
And
know,
it was hard to turn back. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be nice to know more about the decision-making process at that time and why. I think it's fair to ask CPS Energy why they didn't see prices in natural gas being what they are, at that
And
time.
it was $1 billion. It cost $1 billion to construct, pretty much, and they're still paying down debt. And so that's the official statement from CPS Energy. It was the ratepayers would pay for shutting this down early because it's still funding.
And I certainly remember at the time when it was opening, a lot of people were thinking like this is the absolute wrong direction for us to be going at this point. But
You remember that?
Yeah, but as you were saying, I mean, these things are years in the making, and
Right.
and I think the real question would be like, because even when the process started, it was probably evident that maybe this was. I mean, coal was already kind of being looked upon as something of the fuel of the past.
But for the plan to not even to act like it doesn't exist is kind of striking and disappointing in our view.
The city, I mean, the community there needs to be a community conversation about the future of this plant. And I think we all have to recognize it's a super complicated topic because of the debt, because of our poverty, because of the impact on ratepayers, because of climate change. What is the appropriate path forward?
But you gotta acknowledge it and talk about it.
Right. So I mean, it just screams for more discussion.
Yeah. And CPS Energy has something called Flexible Path, which points out what they're going to be doing decades down the road. And as far as you can look down the flexible path, the Spruce 2 remains open. So.
Very interesting. Well, we're going to leave it there. And thank you all for all the insights about the propositions. And if you're listening, please get out and vote. We'll catch up with you next week. Take care.